Muy buenas tardes. Les agradecemos mucho el interés en esta serie de conferencias organizada en conjunto con Fundación UNAM, con el Colegio Nacional y un grupo de universidades y centros de investigación. Las conferencias son sobre diferentes temas y esto pues es ahora parte de nuestras prioridades. El estar organizando conferencias y haciendo invitaciones a investigadores y profesores de las diferentes universidades. En un momento vamos a comentarles un poco más cómo está aquí la organización y pues reiterarles nuestra invitación y el agradecimiento de que nos estén acompañando. El ciclo de conferencias está organizado con ponentes de México y también de varias universidades en otros países. Y en esta ocasión tenemos la fortuna de contar con Daniel Field. Él está en la Universidad de Cambridge en Inglaterra. Entonces, realmente, pues nos da muchísimo gusto y a nombre de todos los que están organizando, pues les agradecemos nuevamente que el interés y que estén participando. El licenciado Dionisio Meade es el presidente de Fundación UNAM y en unos momentos nos va a hacer el favor de darnos unas palabras sobre el trabajo que hace Fundación UNAM, que es una de las riquezas y pilares de la Universidad Nacional, y sobre el interés y la importancia que tienen estos ciclos de conferencias. Nos acompañan el ponente Daniel Field, el licenciado Dionisio Meade, presidente de Fundación UNAM, la licenciada Araceli Rodríguez de Fernández, quien es la directora ejecutiva de Fundación UNAM, y los organizadores de este ciclo de conferencias, Martín Serrano de la Universidad de las Américas y Araxi Urrutia de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Entonces, pues con mucho gusto le pasamos la palabra al licenciado Dionisio Meade, con un saludo muy afectuoso a distancia.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Estar presente en este evento es un singular privilegio para Fundación UNAM. El ciclo de Universidades por la Ciencia articula un esfuerzo que labora una presencia sin fronteras, con los temas más diversos y la participación de universidades de diferentes lugares del mundo, con una amplia presencia de especialistas de la UNAM, de la Universidad de las Américas Puebla, de la UAM Lerma, de Meade y de Cambridge, cuyo especialista nos va a hacer favor de presentarnos hoy su conferencia y a la que se unirán otras en una ejemplar presencia internacional. Además, con el orgullo de sumarnos a una enorme y prestigiada institución, el Colegio Nacional, centro de pensamiento de los más prestigiados hombres de ciencia y reflexión de la inteligencia mexicana, uniendo esfuerzos con Fundación UNAM en este importante proyecto e iniciativa conjunta en apoyo y promoción de la ciencia y la investigación. Muchas gracias, Jaime Urrutia, miembro de la Junta de Gobierno de la UNAM, integrante del Consejo de la Fundación y miembro distinguidísimo del Colegio Nacional, quien nos ha convocado a participar en la organización de este evento. De la mano de tantos y tan extraordinarios especialistas, iremos recorriendo diferentes campos del conocimiento, desde Cuatro Ciénegas, donde está el origen de distintas formas de vida, al recorrido del buque Justo Sierra, en donde quizá nos lleve a Araxi a conocer las raíces del Mar de Cortés, una de las maravillas del mundo. O en otra perspectiva, escucharemos hablar del murciélago, hoy tan estudiado, porque hay quienes piensan que tiene que ver con el origen de la pandemia y su relación con el ágave. Ondas gravitacionales nos llevará al fascinante mundo de la interrelación del tiempo y del espacio, tan cercano a la búsqueda del principio del universo. En matemáticas y arte, mundos que parecerían diferentes, se conjugarán las presentaciones de poetas y científicos, eslabonándose en una bella síntesis y profunda. Con combustibles, energía que mueve al mundo, se cerrará este espacio de intercambio de conocimiento y reflexión. En la energía y es lección de la pandemia está una forma importantísima de proteger nuestro medio ambiente. El día de hoy iniciamos el ciclo con David Field de la Universidad de Cambridge, a quien tenemos el gusto de saludar, que nos hablará sobre el origen de los pájaros, esta especie cuya capacidad de vuelo ha asombrado siempre a los humanos. Nosotros, como Fundación UNAM, nos sentimos especialmente motivados por estar aquí. Como brazo operativo de nuestra universidad, vamos de la mano con sus objetivos: la docencia, la investigación y la difusión de la cultura. Objetivos todos que aquí encuentran una magnífica expresión. Pone en evidencia además ese propósito que desde la Fundación hemos promovido para llevar a nuestros jóvenes a efectuar estudios en otras universidades y en otros países, varias de las cuales están aquí presentes y los han acogido siempre con generosidad, mostrándoles sus capacidades y conocimientos. Este es el crisol que hace mejor a la humanidad. Sería inútil no reconocer lo grave de la actual pandemia, en vidas, en impacto económico, en daño social, en transformación de la cultura política, en las formas de convivencia. Pero sería inadecuado no apreciar también que está abriendo nuevas ventanas, nuevas oportunidades. Hoy estamos aquí unidos por un espacio tecnológico que, si bien ya existía, hoy se ha potenciado. El mundo de la educación a distancia, largamente acariciado, hoy encuentra capacidades no soñadas. La nueva realidad rompe fronteras del conocimiento y por estas vías la comunicación será cada vez más amplia y cada vez más fluida. También lo será el espacio de la cooperación y la investigación, en la investigación y el conocimiento. Este evento lo acredita claramente y es pionero de lo que podemos hacer en el futuro. La pandemia será vencida, dejará dolores y costos, pero abrirán nuevas oportunidades y un mundo más cercano, más integrado, más incluyente, más justo, con una mayor protección del planeta, nuestra casa común. Es la historia del hombre: superar retos y generar nuevos y mejores espacios. Las universidades y los universitarios serán una vez más protagonistas de esta nueva etapa en la historia. Estarán a la altura. Muchas gracias a todos por esta oportunidad. Gracias a nombre de Fundación UNAM.
Agradecemos mucho a nuestro presidente de Fundación UNAM por estas palabras y estas reflexiones, las cuales pues compartimos ampliamente. Por un lado, pues estamos trabajando y por el otro, pues realmente estamos preocupados y compartimos todos los problemas y las familias que están siendo afectadas en todos los países. Eso yo creo que es una de nuestras preocupaciones principales en la Universidad Nacional y en todas las universidades que están participando en este consorcio. Dentro de este contexto, vamos ahora a pasar a la presentación de nuestro conferencista, al cual nuevamente le reiteramos nuestro agradecimiento por participar. El doctor Daniel Field ha venido a México, es uno de los grandes entusiastas en la colaboración internacional. Y esta es la otra parte, la otra componente de esta serie de conferencias, la necesidad de ampliar la colaboración internacional a todos los niveles. Entonces, con gente como Daniel, entusiasta y siempre abierto a colaborar, es realmente un placer el que iniciemos estas conferencias internacionales. Vamos a tener ahora la presentación del ciclo y en particular de todo el trabajo maravilloso que hace Daniel. Es una de las aventuras de investigación más interesantes que podamos ver, y Daniel es un entusiasta al cual pues ustedes lo van a ver, se nota el entusiasmo que le pone a su trabajo. Entonces, por favor, pasamos a la presentación. No está el sonido.
Listo. Muchísimas gracias. Es un honor contar con la participación del Colegio Nacional y ahora pues se suma también Fundación UNAM. Es un honor tener al licenciado Dionisio Meade diciendo tan bonitas palabras que ojalá nos sirvan de inspiración para tener más logros. I'm gonna switch to English since that's gonna be the language that this talk is gonna be anyway, so I better ease you in. If we can have the first slide, ¿podríamos tener la diapositiva? This is a talk by the organized under the Universities for Science Consortium. So we came up with this only very recently as a way to try to make use of these new opportunities that the use of virtual technologies are opening in order to build bridges across large distances and bring together scientists from around the world for collaboration in research projects, but also to give or contribute to science communication. So we have a number of institutions which are part of this consortium, and so we have Fundación UNAM, we have la Universidad de las Américas en Puebla, el Instituto de Ecología de la UNAM, el Colegio Nacional, la Universidad de Arizona con Biosfera 2 y la Universidad de Arizona, el Centro de Ciencias Genómicas, el Centro de Ciencias de la Complejidad, la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Unidad Lerma, el Centro de Estudios Mexicanos de la UNAM en el Reino Unido, and the Milner Center for Evolution from the University of Bath. So we are planning to have many more events, hopefully, and we are hoping this is just the beginning. We are very pleased in particular to welcome the Centro for the Ciencias de la Complejidad. They are very kindly not only joining the consortium, but also inviting everybody to their seminar series, which takes place on Thursdays at midday. So the next talk will be on that series will be from Dr. Raúl Rojas from the University of Berlin, and he will be talking about the language of mathematics. From this series, the next one will be on next Tuesday by Dr. Pablo Orozco from Cardiff University, and he will be talking about the history of domestication. So I'm gonna now present our today's speaker. So Dr. Daniel Field has an absolutely impressive career, not only in terms of the sheer number of publications he has already got, but also because he has managed to literally publish in every single one of the top journals on general sciences and also in life sciences. So he has several papers in Nature, PNAS, Current Biology, and many others. If you look at his publication record, you will never guess that he only finished his PhD in 2016. So he graduated from Yale University in 2016 and then arrived in Bath, at the University of Bath, and joined the Milner Center for Evolution as a Prize Fellow. And is now university lecturer at the Department of Earth Sciences at Cambridge University. He's also a fellow in natural sciences at Christ College, and holds also a position at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So as it was mentioned before, he is a very enthusiastic scientist, and it's a joy to interact and work with him at any level. And in addition to being an expert in the study of fossils, especially fossils of ancient birds or bird ancestors, he's also a very keen birder. So he combines the use of the fossil record and also the study of living species in order to understand how this clade first evolved. So Daniel, it's a joy to have you here, and hopefully we'll get to see you soon back in Mexico. We're very pleased to start with your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Araxi. Thank you to you, and thank you so much to Jaime Urrutia and to the Colegio Nacional for the opportunity to give this online presentation. It's a delight. It's been a couple of years since I've been to Mexico, but I can't wait to have an opportunity to visit again, you know, when travel is a thing that humans are allowed to do. So I'll share my screen now and move over here to this presentation, and I'm very excited to have a chance to talk to so many of you online right now. Buenos tardes a todos. Thank you for the opportunity to give this talk in English, porque mi español no es bueno. Araxi knows this, and I have a PhD student named Juan Benito who can also confirm that. But it's a great joy to have a chance to talk to you about a new fossil discovery that we published on recently, which translates into Spanish roughly as El Pollo Magnífico. So I'm very excited to tell you about that, but before I do, I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of our research on the evolution of birds, just to help explain why what we call the wonder chicken, or the Pollo Magnífico, is such an exciting fossil to us. So for evolutionary biologists like myself, birds are a fascinating group of organisms to study because they're the most diverse group of tetrapod animals in the world. There are nearly 11,000 living species, and of course you're only looking at a small sample of them in this image, but you can see very easily that they exhibit such an incredible degree of variety in terms of their colors and their forms and the lifestyles that they exhibit. So trying to understand how this amazing diversity, both in terms of the number of species and in terms of the variety of forms that birds show, is a really fascinating thing to do. So I am a vertebrate paleontologist, which means that I mostly study fossils. So most of the data that I work with as a scientist looks something like this. But as Araxi mentioned, I enjoy spending a lot of time in the field observing and photographing wild birds. And this is includes Mexico as well. That photo of the green bird sort of in the middle at the top was taken just outside Mexico City in Xochicalco a couple of years ago. That's Momotus mexicanus. But spending this time in the field is fantastic, first of all, because birds are so fascinating for many, many reasons, but also because as a scientist studying their evolution, getting to know the birds better in the wild can help us try to frame questions targeting the early evolutionary history of their biology and behavior much better than we could otherwise do. So for anybody, paleontologists included, who is interested in trying to understand how living bird diversity came to be, the last 15 years or so have been very exciting because there have been huge developments in our ability to sequence large degrees of genomic data from living birds, as well as developments in terms of computer resources that allow us to analyze those huge genetic data sets in more sophisticated ways. So these advances have allowed us to generate a clearer picture of the bird family tree than we've ever had before. So this is an image of a family tree of birds from a paper led by Rick Prum and Jake Berv that we published about 5 years ago. And it provides us with a nice overview of how the major living groups of birds are related to one another. And for evolutionary biologists, having a family tree like this is very useful because it can help us try to understand the evolutionary processes that led to interesting patterns across the bird family tree. So as an example, we can focus on one group of birds over here. We'll draw a box around that group in gray, which is a group that we call the paleognathe birds. But they include the largest birds in the world today, the flightless birds, ostriches, rheas, emus, and a few other groups as well. But these new bird family trees have taught us something very surprising, which is that the large size and flightless biology of these birds seems to have evolved independently in all of these different groups. And we know that because some of these large flightless birds are actually more closely related to small-bodied flying birds called tinamous, some of which live in Mexico, than they are to other large flightless paleognaths. So it seems like this very large body size and flightless locomotor mode is something that has arisen several times within this group of birds, which is something we would not have known without these new family trees. If we focus on this group of birds in brown here, there's another interesting story because this is the group that includes some of the most charismatic and characteristic birds that you can see in the New World, in Mexico especially, the hummingbirds. So there are hundreds of different species of hummingbirds. I've only illustrated 2 here. But the family tree of this group tells us that hummingbirds, which of course are small-bodied and colorful, drink nectar from flowers, and are active during the day, appear to have arisen from ancestors that were much larger, active during the night or nocturnal, and colored in this very cryptic way, not brightly colored at all. So this was a big surprise in order to understand where hummingbirds fit on the bird family tree as well. And a final example, we could sort of play this game all day because there's so many of these interesting evolutionary stories. But another interesting one is over here, these birds shown on a green background, because that group includes what we call the passerine birds or the perching birds, which is the largest group of living birds around today. There are over 6,000 living species. So there are just a few of those passerines illustrated here. You can see there's a huge variety in their forms and coloration. But very interestingly, we have learned from these new family trees that the closest living relatives of passerine birds happen to be parrots, of all things, which we would think, without any other evidence, might be quite surprising because they do look very different. So these are some of the fascinating inferences that we're able to draw from these new bird family trees. But there's actually even more interesting information that we can obtain from these bird family trees, because these family trees are not only an indication of how the different groups of birds are related to one another, they also give us an indication of when, in the history of our planet, important evolutionary events took place. And that is possible because these family trees are generated using gene sequence data, and we can combine that genomic information with information from the fossil record. So if we calibrate rates of genetic change across the bird family tree, with the earliest known occurrences of fossil birds across the bird family tree, we can use the ages of those fossils to calibrate what we call a molecular clock. and thereby generate an estimate of when in Earth history, how long ago these different major groups of birds last shared an ancestor with one another. So if you look over on the side at the vertical axis of the tree, you can see that the vertical axis of the tree is scaled to an estimate of time. And if you keep that sort of evolutionary time scale in mind, when you look at the bird family tree, if you look down towards the bottom of the family tree, you might see something very surprising, which is that many of the deepest divergences within the living bird family tree appear to have taken place at one point in the history of our planet in particular. And if you look over at the time scale, you'll see that this corresponds to something that happened around 66 or so million years ago. So what happened 66 million years ago? Well, something that is directly relevant to any listeners in Mexico. A very dramatic thing happened 66 million years ago, one of the most catastrophic events in the history of our planet. The planet was struck by a giant asteroid. And of course, that asteroid struck in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, near the village of Chicxulub. So I'm sure there are many listeners in Mexico at the Colegio Nacional and elsewhere who probably know far more about the physics of this asteroid impact than I do. So I'll keep it very simple here at a level that I can understand. This was a very serious and catastrophic event in the history of our planet. We're talking about a massive body from outer space hitting the Earth at extremely high speeds and leaving what is still visible today. It's, of course, buried by lots of sediment, but a detectable crater over 150 kilometers in diameter that overlaps the northern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula and goes into the Gulf of Mexico. So this was a major event that took place 66.02 million years ago, and it affected life on Earth to a huge degree. Of course, as I'm sure many of you know, the giant dinosaurs all disappeared, coinciding with this asteroid impact. But if we're focusing on birds here, this asteroid impact seems to have played a major role in essentially separating a period of Earth history, which you can sort of see represented over on the left of this slide, where the most bird-like animals around were outside of modern bird diversity. So this includes all non-avian dinosaurs as well as close relatives of modern birds. So the asteroid impact separates a world dominated by those ancient monsters from a world dominated by what we consider to be crown group birds or modern birds, which seem to have diversified very rapidly in the early part of the Cenozoic era, this period of time following the age of dinosaurs after the asteroid impact. So if we're going to study the evolutionary history of birds, this interval surrounding the asteroid impact, both before and after the asteroid impact, is very important to help us understand how modern birds arose. And so it's very interesting to sort of look back at the history of research about birds and this enormous asteroid impact, because it wasn't very long ago that we really had no clear understanding of how this major event in Earth history affected birds. In fact, less than 20 years ago, some prominent bird paleontologists basically summarized the situation by saying that our understanding at that point in time about the influence of this extinction event on the evolution of birds was very incomplete. We really didn't know much about it. And that remained the case for a little while because we essentially did not know when ancient, archaic bird-like forms disappeared. But relatively recent research in the last decade has shown that many lineages of archaic bird-like forms from the age of dinosaurs persisted all the way through the age of dinosaurs up to the asteroid impact, what we call the KPG boundary, after which point they never appear in the fossil record again. So this evidence suggests very clearly that these archaic birds were driven to extinction along with the giant dinosaurs when the asteroid struck the Earth, and that probably only a small number of modern bird lineages were present at the end of the age of dinosaurs and managed to survive this asteroid impact. So all of this work suggests very strongly that the Chicxulub asteroid impact greatly affected the evolutionary history of birds, which raises some important questions. One of which is which bird groups, modern bird groups, were actually around at the end of the age of dinosaurs and managed to survive this asteroid impact. Another question is, how did those birds manage to survive when so many of their relatives disappeared? What actually happened to bird biology after the asteroid struck? And a third question is, what happened to the habitat that birds live in and rely on after the asteroid struck the Earth? Because we know that the asteroids caused widespread destruction of habitats on a global scale. Well, to answer the first question, which birds survived, we can come up with a guess based on our family trees. So again, if we look down towards the bottom of our family tree, we see that there are only a handful of lineages that seem to have crossed the KPG boundary when the asteroid struck. And so if we draw a simplified bird family tree, basically summarizing which of those lineages were around, that family tree looks like this. We think that we had the early ancestors of that group that ultimately gave rise to ostriches and tinamous around prior to the asteroid impact. So that's shown over on the left. We think that we may have also had the very early ancestors of the group that today includes chickens and their relatives and ducks and their relatives. So that group is shown in green and blue. And then we think that we had maybe the early ancestors of the group that includes all other living birds. But we think that for all of these lineages, only the very early ancestors of the modern descendants of these groups may have been present at the end of the age of dinosaurs. So what about that second question? How did those lineages manage to survive the extinction event? Well, my colleague Jake Berv and I were interested in trying to understand how the extinction event affected the body size of birds. And by combining information from the genomes of living birds as well as fossil birds, we concluded that the surviving lineages of birds that made it through this extinction event must have been smaller than their ancestors that were around prior to the asteroid impact. And this makes some sense. Small-bodied birds require less food than large-bodied birds do. So all else equal, you might expect that small-bodied birds would be the lineages to survive this extinction event, which of course caused lots of problems in terms of ecosystem function and food availability. But this is a very interesting conclusion because lots of other important biological variables coincide with body size. So smaller bodied birds show higher rates of genome evolution than larger bodied birds do. So if only small bodied birds survived the extinction event, then that might tell us something interesting about how quickly the modern bird radiation took place after the asteroid impact. So we think that body size was an important factor related to the survival of some lineages of birds across the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. And how about that third question? What happened to bird habitats? Well, this is an important question because modeling has shown, and I'll start a little video here, that in the hours following this massive asteroid impact, large portions of the Earth would have been heated to temperatures higher than the spontaneous combustion temperature of vegetation. So we think that the asteroid impact and the very hot ejecta that would have rained back across the Earth's surface following the asteroid impact would have caused deforestation and defoliation on a very large global scale. And of course, many groups of birds are dependent on living in trees. So we think that bird habitats were greatly affected by this asteroid impact. But to get a better understanding of what happened to forests 66 million years ago, we decided to work with some paleobotanists, specialists in fossil plants and pollen, to try to figure out what happened to these bird habitats. So that's a picture of Reagan Dunn down below and a picture of Antoine Bercovici, both of whom are leading experts on the fossil record of pollen across the KPG boundary. And Reagan and Antoine generated a very interesting data set where they sampled very, very finely, sort of millimeter by millimeter, through rocks that span the end Cretaceous mass extinction event. So those rocks labeled with the number 1 down below, those are rocks laid down at the very end of the age of dinosaurs. And rocks labeled 2 above, those are rocks laid down at the very, very start of the Cenozoic era. So the rocks in between correspond to the KPG boundary and the immediate aftermath of the extinction event. So Reagan and Antoine sampled these rocks for microscopic evidence of fossil pollen grains and plant spores. And when they generated microscope slides for their pollen data from the end of the age of dinosaurs, the slides looked like this. They were dominated by a diverse and abundant array of angiosperm and gymnosperm pollen. But when we crossed the KPG boundary after the asteroid impact, those pollens disappear, and instead the microscope slides are dominated by fern spores. So this corresponds to something that we call the KPG boundary fern spike. So when Reagan and Antoine plot their data on a geological stratigraphic column here, we can see what happened very clearly. We see that the abundance of Cretaceous angiosperm pollens disappears, coinciding with the KPG boundary, but also coinciding with that boundary, we see an explosion in the abundance of those fern spores, which is interesting because in modern ecosystems, ferns are often the earliest pioneer colonizing plants to take over denuded landscapes after wildfires or volcanic flows. And we also see the very slow and protracted recovery of canopy-forming trees, which probably would have taken hundreds to thousands of years to recover. So on the basis of these data from fossil pollens and other plant microfossils, it seems like the habitat that birds lived in after the asteroid struck was greatly impacted. So what does that actually mean for birds when we keep in mind this evidence for global deforestation coinciding with the asteroid impact? Well, first of all, we see at the KPG boundary the complete disappearance of the most abundant and diverse group of bird-like animals from the age of dinosaurs. This is a group called the Enantiornithines, which basically were predominantly a group of tree-dwelling birds, which you can tell based on the structure of their foot. So this group of birds was abundant and diverse throughout the age of dinosaurs, and it disappears when the asteroid struck. And we think that was probably related to the destruction of their forest habitats. Also, suggesting that birds were greatly impacted by this deforestation, we see that several groups of living birds show fossil ancestors in the early part of the Cenozoic era that probably lived on the ground. So the early ancestors of these groups seem to have been predominantly ground-dwelling, whereas the present-day descendants of many of these groups live in trees. And we also see evidence just from the bird family tree, the family tree of modern birds, that those lineages of birds that seem to have crossed the KPG boundary, that lineage including ostrich-like birds, the lineage including chicken-like birds and duck-like birds, and the lineage leading to all other birds, those birds were presumably ground-dwelling at the time of the asteroid impact as well. So let's dig into the evidence for that second point that I was talking about regarding those ground-dwelling fossil relatives of tree-dwelling birds today. So in order to sort of discuss the evidence for that hypothesis, we have to focus in on this group in purple, which is a group that we have named Oteidomorphae. So Oteidomorphae is a fascinating group of birds because it unites many disparate lineages of birds that show very different ecological habits. So over on the left, we see a group of birds called turicos, which live in Africa today, which are tree-dwelling birds. That's what the green circle denotes. We also have a group of birds called cuckoos, that group shown by 3 species in the middle. So cuckoos today are a highly diverse group of birds, some of which live in trees, shown in green, some of which live on the ground, shown in brown. So that's a roadrunner, geococcyx. So of course the greater roadrunner and the lesser roadrunner both live in Mexico. And then in the middle, we have a group of cuckoos called cuckolls that spend some of their time in trees and some of their time on the ground. So this group Oteidomorphae also includes a group way over on the right called bustards, which are very large-bodied ground-dwelling birds. So why are we talking about Oteidomorphae? Well, the earliest fossil representative we have from Oteidomorphae is a fossil from 52 million years ago called Phoropinarium. And it appears to be a very early relative of the turicos, that group on the left that lives in trees today. Now, one thing that we see when we look at the legs of Oteidomorphae is that oteidomorphs that live in trees in the present day tend to have relatively short legs. But oteidomorphs that spend most of their lives on the ground tend to have relatively long legs. And that fossil Phoropinarium is interesting because it seems to be an early representative of that lineage, the turicos, which today live in trees, but it has very long legs, suggesting that its lifestyle may have been more similar to the lifestyle of a small bustard in that it would have been ground dwelling, as opposed to living in trees like living turicos do. So we see this story in multiple groups when we look at fossils from the early part of the Cenozoic era, suggesting that many living tree-dwelling groups arose from ground-dwelling ancestors. So on the whole, it seems like bird habitats in terms of forests were globally devastated in the aftermath of the extinction event. So overall, it seems like this asteroid impact was not really good news for birds at all. So we have a little illustration here of a frightened looking bird in the aftermath of the extinction event of the asteroid impact dealing with global wildfires. But we think that this bird, which is sort of a hypothetical reconstruction of an early paleognathe, may have managed to survive because it was relatively small-bodied and also ground-dwelling. Okay, so we've talked about 3 major hypotheses for what birds were like when the asteroid struck. We think that any birds around when the asteroid struck would have been part of a deep evolutionary branch within the bird family tree. We think they would have been relatively small-bodied, and we think that they would have been predominantly non-tree dwelling. But there's a problem. The bird fossil record, the very end of the age of dinosaurs, is very sparse, and we have very little evidence of modern birds from the end of the age of dinosaurs in the form of actual fossils, which means that in order to actually determine whether any of the stuff that I just told you is correct, it means that we really need direct fossil evidence of birds from this point in Earth history. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. This is where the pollo magnífico comes in. So the story about the pollo magnífico starts actually relatively recently. This is a story of a fossil that was given to us in December 2018, so very recently. And you can see a photograph of the fossil up at the top of the screen. And one thing you first of all might notice about the fossil is that it's not very pretty. And the second thing you might notice about the fossil is that it's really quite small. So when we were provided these fossils, which were found in Belgium, we weren't actually that excited about them because, I mean, it didn't seem like a particularly exciting fossil. So I'm going to play a little video down at the bottom to give you a sense of what the fossil looks like. So what you're looking at there is a broken thigh bone. That bone is the femur. And if we pick up that small chunk of rock and turn it around, we can see a few things. We see some fish bones poking out below the femur, not very exciting. But then on the other side of the block, we see another long bone. That bone is part of a shin bone, so the lower leg bone, from a bird. So we were interested in this fossil, not because it was very beautiful, but because it comes from a very important point in Earth history. So once again, the asteroid hit the Earth 66.02 million years ago. And this fossil comes from somewhere between 66.8 million years ago and 66.7 million years ago. So we were excited about this fossil because it comes from such an important point in the history of our planet, from the very, very end of the age of dinosaurs. And we were hopeful that this fossil might tell us something about how and why birds managed to survive the asteroid impact. So we decided to take a very close look at this fossil, even though we didn't think it was going to be particularly pretty. So we took the fossil, which is, just a few bones poking out from a rock, and we put them into a fancy machine. This is a high-resolution micro CT scanner, very powerful X-ray CT scanner, here at the University of Cambridge at a facility called the Cambridge Biotomography Center. Way over on the left, it's not a very complete picture of her, but that's the technician who runs this lab. That's Keturah Smithson, who's a fabulous scientist herself, and she helped us obtain a lot of information from this fossil. So we took it, we placed it inside this fancy machine, and we bombarded it with very high energy X-rays. And what happened next was very unexpected and very exciting for us. So I have another video to share with you. It's a sort of a replay of what happened when we first obtained this high-resolution CT data. So I was working on this with my PhD student, Juan Benito, from Barcelona. And what you can see sort of on the screen in white is a very sort of blurry image of the outside of the fossil block. But this technique, this X-ray CT scanning technique, allows us to peer inside of the rock to see if there are any additional bones visible. So I'll play the video now, and you can sort of see what we experienced when we remove that rock. To our complete amazement, we saw that there was a nearly complete three-dimensionally preserved skull of this fossil bird inside that tiny piece of rock. So the video that I just showed you is actually not accurate at all, because when we did peer inside the rock and saw that there was a skull there, we almost died and we lost our minds, and there was lots of shouting and lots of excitement. But when we were being filmed, we had to pretend to be professional. So this was the most exciting thing. To tell you the truth, this was the most exciting thing I've ever seen in my life. There are no well-preserved fossil bird skulls of this age known in the entire world. So we realized when we saw this fossil that it would provide the best opportunity we have ever had to understand what happened to birds when the asteroid struck the Earth. So I'll show you some nicer images of the inside of that fossil block. So once again, you're looking at the outside of the rock, and that's the leg bone, the thigh bone, also known as the femur that you can see down below. And if we peer inside the block, you can see that skull. It's only a millimeter or two below the femur. It's extraordinary that it was not visible initially. And spending hundreds of hours extracting this anatomy allowed Juan and my additional PhD student, Albert Chen, who worked very hard on this project, to generate a complete three-dimensional model of the skull, which we were able to study in extraordinary detail from all different perspectives. And you can see, looking at the scale bar down below, that we're looking at a very, very small fossil bird skull. So we were pretty excited about this. There are some very exciting aspects of the skull. It didn't take us long to name the fossil the wonder chicken, the pollo magnífico, because there are some very obvious similarities in the skull to what we see in the skulls of living chicken-like birds. So if we look at the skull of the turkey over on the left, the pavo, we see that the aspects of the bill, the beak of the bird, are very similar. So the main bone that sort of forms the midline of the bill is called the premaxilla. And as you can see in the turkey, as well as in the wonder chicken, those bones, those premaxillary bones on the left side and the right side, are not fused. This is a feature that we see in many chicken-like birds today. And also the bones at the back of the nostrils on the beak, called the nasal bones, are shaped in a very similar way. They're sort of unfused to the rest, and they're sort of shaped like this, in a U shape. Now, if we look at the back of the skull, we see some important similarities with the skulls of living duck-like birds. So there's the skull of a mallard duck, a very basic sort of duck skull. And you can see that behind the eye, there's a bony projection pointing forwards towards the bill in the skull of the duck and in the skull of the wonder chicken. And the shape of the skull from above is very similar in the wonder chicken and the duck as well. So there are important similarities with the skulls of chicken-like birds and duck-like birds, depending on which part of the skull you look at. So in some ways, it seems like a combination of features that we see in living chicken relatives and duck relatives. So this is very interesting because if you remember from what I mentioned before, chicken-like birds are the closest living relatives of duck-like birds. So today, there are 300 living species of chicken-like birds called galliformes, and about 177 living species of duck-like birds called anseriformes. But we've never seen something, a fossil, that appears to be close to the last common ancestor of these chicken-like birds and duck-like birds. So we think that the wonder chicken might be very close to the last common ancestor of those two major lineages of living birds. And that's very important because it agrees with our expectation that a fossil of a modern bird from the end of the age of dinosaurs should be part of a deep branch within the living bird family tree. So as you can see, chicken-like birds and duck-like birds, this group called Galloanceri, is one of the 3 deepest lineages of birds within the modern bird family tree. And the ancestral lineage of Galloanceri is one of the very small number of lineages that we think might have been present at the end of the age of dinosaurs. So we think that the wonder chicken is probably close to the last common ancestor of chicken-like birds and duck-like birds, and is part of this very, very deeply diverging lineage within the bird family tree. So just to make this clear, we can look at our family tree again, and we can look at where chicken-like birds and duck-like birds sit on the family tree. They are this group in red here. So we're pointing to that ancestral lineage that has given rise to these two groups. And if we superimpose the position of the KPG boundary, you see that we expected that the earliest ancestors of Galloanceri might have been present at the end of the age of dinosaurs. And indeed, this is where the fossil would have sat positioned in time. And it seems to confirm our expectations that modern birds at the end of the age of dinosaurs were sort of close to the last common ancestor of all birds themselves. So what about the size of the wonder chicken? Does it support the idea that an avian survivor, a modern bird from the end of the age of dinosaurs, would have been relatively small? Well, what you see here are the body sizes of living duck-like birds called Anseriformes in blue, and chicken-like birds called Galliformes in green. So their body mass is shown on the vertical axis, and you can see that in both groups there are just a few very, very large living species. So there's a living mute swan, a very, very large living bird, shown on this distribution. And if we plot the wonder chicken on this distribution, we see that it's about the same size as one of the smallest living ducks, called the green-winged teal, Anis creca, and a relatively small partridge called the gray partridge. And so we think that the fossil bird, the wonder chicken, would have weighed somewhere around 395 grams. So just to give you a sense of how small this bird was, this is a 3D prototype, a 3D print of the skull of the wonder chicken at life size. So for scale, I'm not that big. I'm about 6 feet tall, and really that's not a very large bird skull. So it seems to agree with the expectation that surviving lineages of birds were relatively small. Okay, what about our third expectation, that any surviving bird probably would not have been a tree dweller? Well, remember what we talked about before when we were talking about oteidomorphy, when we saw that ground-dwelling birds tend to have longer legs than tree-dwelling birds. And even though the leg bones of the wonder chicken are not very well preserved, they are well preserved enough for us to be able to reconstruct aspects of their leg proportions. And when we looked at the legs of the wonder chicken, we saw that their limb bones were relatively narrow and relatively long, suggesting that they were probably ground dwelling. And that's additionally interesting when you think about where the wonder chicken lived. So before we talk about that, I think that based on the observations we can make from this new fossil, all of these expectations about what birds were like at the end of the age of dinosaurs seem to be upheld. But what about the lifestyle of the wonder chicken? Well, because it had relatively long, narrow legs, and because the rocks came from an environment that 66 million years ago would have been part of a shallow, warm sea very close to shore, we think that the wonder chicken may have spent much of its time on the beach. And we think that its ecology might have been very similar to that of a living shorebird. So this is a beautiful reconstruction, putting together all of the best information we were able to gather about the wonder chicken, painted by a fantastic artist named Phil Krasminski. And he's done a great job of putting the wonder chicken in its original environmental context, walking along a tropical shoreline in what was to become Europe 66 million years later. So that's essentially what we've been able to say about the wonder chicken, but there's lots more information about it as well. So if there's anybody interested in learning more about our research on this fossil or our research on the origin of birds, I'd like to draw your attention to an online museum exhibit that we've put together. This is largely the work of Rob Theodore from the Sedgwick Museum of Earth Sciences here at Cambridge. And if you go to that URL that I'm showing at the top of the slide, you'll be able to learn even more about the wonder chicken and have a close look at its anatomy. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and first of all say thank you so much to the Colegio Nacional and Dr. Jaime Urrutia and Araxi Urrutia for the opportunity to speak today. It's an honor to present to all of you. I'd like to acknowledge the assistance of many, many people with all of the research that I presented today, as well as my research group. There's a photograph of them there. And I'll highlight Juan Benito and Albert Chen, who were key collaborators on all of the wonder chicken work that I shared today, as well as our colleagues John Jacht and Dan Sepke. John is from the Natural History Museum of Maastricht in the Netherlands, and Dan Sepke is from the Bruce Museum in Connecticut, and they were key collaborators on the wonder chicken work as well. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
So, Daniel, thank you very much. I think it was an excellent presentation as usual. Let me just get to the questions. So, I think there was a lot of interest on how these birds were actually first evolving. I'll need to very quickly turn down the volume because we have a streaming going on here at home as well.
Okay.
Yes, so sorry for that. It's just that my son is a big fan of your talks as well. So I think there's a lot of talk that after the demise of the dinosaurs, sort of mammals took over. So, but in reality, we see a huge radiation of birds as well. So, would you say that after the fall of the dinosaurs, we see an equal degree of success from the avian lineages compared to the mammalian lineages? Or if the mammals really had an edge over birds, why do you think that would be?
Well, when you look at evolutionary patterns in both birds and mammals across this extinction event and into the early part of the Cenozoic, you see some distinct similarities. So in many ways, it seems that both of those groups radiated very rapidly following the mass extinction event. And of course, if you look at the mammal fossil record, you can see that within 10 million years of the extinction event, mammals had evolved into a huge variety of different forms and sizes than existed prior to the mass extinction event. So it seems like between birds and mammals, both of those groups moved into a huge number of new ecological niches quite quickly following the extinction event after the disappearance of the large dinosaurs and many other groups. And there are many similarities in the evolutionary trajectory of birds and mammals. The Cenozoic era, this period of time that we're still in, that follows the age of dinosaurs, is often called the age of mammals. And of course, that's an appropriate name. There are over 5,000 living species of mammals today. But I think as a bird person, it's worth noting that there are about twice as many living species of birds. So it would also be fair to call the present day the age of birds. Or if you really want to be technical, of course, birds are dinosaurs. So you could argue that the age of dinosaurs never ended. But I do think that anybody interested in drawing parallels between the evolutionary trajectory of mammals and the evolutionary trajectory of birds following this mass extinction event will find many, many very interesting similarities. I think that the degree of similarity in both of those groups is something that still remains to be studied in as much detail as it deserves.
So thank you very much. We have questions from Grant Simpson. He is asking how the ability to fly influenced whether birds would become extinct or not. And also, why is it that other flying reptiles became extinct on the KPG boundary?
So those are both very good questions. First of all, I will say that we think that all of the surviving lineages of birds that managed to make it through this mass extinction event probably could fly. So even though we think that these groups were probably largely ground-dwelling birds, we think that they were capable of flight. And so independent evolutionary transitions to flightlessness, we believe, would have been something that only occurred after the mass extinction event. in multiple different lineages of birds. But interestingly, we think that some groups of birds lost the ability to fly relatively quickly following the extinction event. For example, the oldest penguins that we know of are between 61 and 62 million years old, which suggests that already, only a few million years after the extinction event, there were already relatively large-bodied, relatively modern-looking penguins around on the planet. So we think that transitions to flightlessness happened pretty quickly after the extinction event, as birds moved into these new evolutionary niches and took advantage of new evolutionary opportunities. But I think that all of those lineages that did survive would have been flying birds. In response to Graham's second question, why did birds survive when these flying reptiles that were around at the end of the age of dinosaurs, called pterosaurs, went extinct, is also a very, very interesting question, and it's difficult to answer. But I think there's a bit of a hint provided by looking at fossil birds from the age of dinosaurs that also did not survive. So you'll remember we were talking about some archaic lineages of birds outside of modern bird diversity that failed to make it across the KPG boundary. Many of those lineages were relatively larger than those lineages that we do think survived. And probably body size was not the only important thing happening to birds at the time. But body size was clearly very important. And in terrestrial environments, it seems like nothing larger than the size of a relatively small cat or, or a little puppy would have managed to survive anywhere on the planet. So one important thing to keep in mind about pterosaurs towards the end of the age of dinosaurs is that many of them were very large. In fact, the largest flying vertebrates of all time are some pterosaurs from the end of the age of dinosaurs. So animals that size simply would have been selected against, probably because their total metabolic requirements were simply too high. So we think that one of the major reasons that these small-bodied animals survived preferentially over large-bodied animals is simply that they required fewer resources in order to survive than the large-bodied ones did.
So would you say then that body size was more important than having the ability to fly in the survival of any species after the at the boundary? So do you think then that the fact that all bird lineages that crossed that boundary were flying birds, was that because there were probably any non-flying lineages at the time? Or was it because actually flying gave them an advantage in their survival? Or do you think it was mostly body size?
Well, I think that both of those things were important. So I think there's been a real tendency for a while for people thinking about these problems to develop an argument in favor of a certain parameter, if it's body size or flying ability or habitat preference or food preference or geographic region or anything like that. Presumably, all of those factors were important. And trying to understand the extent to which all of those factors worked together to govern patterns of survival and extinction is something that we're still in the process of doing. So I will say that all else equal, a very small-bodied bird capable of flight would have been much more likely to survive than a large-bodied bird that would have been incapable of flight. So flying is probably important just because it might make it easier to explore different areas. If your normal area of occupancy is destroyed or unsuitable because food resources have disappeared or something like that, having the ability to fly might open other opportunities to explore potentially a suitable habitat. So that's why we think that flying would have been important. But the body size parameter seems to have been very important as well. So it's a little hard to say which of those parameters was more important, but I do think they both were significant.
So we have a related question on the effect of size and survival. So I'm probably going to say this wrong, but the question is, why is it that the small-sized enantiorhynchs did not survive, even though they were small?
So that's hard to say. I think that, well, so for anybody not familiar with this extremely difficult to pronounce term, the enantiornithines, that was that group of birds, bird-like animals outside of modern bird diversity that was very diverse and widespread during the age of dinosaurs. And they disappear at the KPG boundary. So of course, some of them were small-bodied. Some of them would have been obviously highly capable of flight. So why did they not survive? Well, an important reason, I think, probably has to do with habitat destruction. So we think that small-bodied enantiornithines that would have lived in trees would have been selected against on the basis of the destruction of habitat. But there's something else that's important that I should mention. We talk about these three lineages of modern birds that probably survived the KPG extinction event, the lineage leading to the relatives of ostriches, the lineage leading to duck-like birds and chicken-like birds, and the lineage leading to everything else. But probably, even among a species that survived, probably survivorship was relatively low, even among surviving species. I think that's important to add. I think the world was an extremely inhospitable place in the aftermath of that asteroid impact. And I think the likelihood of any species, even if they were small-bodied and could fly and lived on the ground, the probability of survivorship was probably low. So to some extent, the extinction of small-bodied enantiornithines might have had to do with chance. They might have been unlucky. But I think it's also important to remember that most enantiornithines that are known, especially small-bodied enantiornithines, show feet that suggest that they would have been perching birds and probably would have lived in trees. So we think that habitat destruction was very important in driving the extinction of those enantiornithines.
So we have a question as well coming in saying, why is it that so many lineages seem to have independently lost the ability to fly so quickly after the boundary? So what drove that if clearly flying provides advantages?
Well, flying does provide advantages, but it also provides disadvantages. So flying is extremely energetically costly. So very often in the present day, when lineages of flying birds colonize areas that are not inhabited by predators, birds will very rapidly lose the ability to fly. So if you look at places like New Zealand, unfortunately, many of those flightless birds have been driven to extinction by humans and pests introduced by humans. But New Zealand is an example of a landmass that for tens of millions of years did not have ground-dwelling mammalian predators. And as a result, you saw multiple different lineages of flying birds lose the ability to fly on New Zealand. So even today, there are things like kiwis in New Zealand, and there are things that there's a flightless parrot that still survives in New Zealand called the kakapo. Those seem to be evolutionary holdovers from a time when New Zealand was not inhabited by predators. Obviously, a flightless bird is relatively poorly defended. So in the aftermath of the extinction event, dinosaurs disappear. There are multiple lineages of birds that appear to have lost the ability to fly. I already mentioned penguins, but also relatively early in the Cenozoic, you see the origin of a group of birds that we call terror birds that lived in South America, that were very large-bodied, flightless birds that would have been very scary. those are only two examples of lineages that lost the ability to fly early in the Cenozoic, and that probably has something to do with the relaxation of pressure from mammalian predators or dinosaurian predators in the early part of the Cenozoic.
Thank you very much. There are several questions regarding the pollo magnífico. So the first one comes from Patricia Fierro, and she's interested in how is it that if you only found the skull and leg bone, was the whole body structure of the bird reconstructed for the representation that you showed at the end?
Well, so that's a great question from Patricia. There's lots of educated guesswork that has gone into it. So she's correct that we mostly only have the skull, the legs, and then a few little fragments of other bones, the portions of one of the wing bones, for example. But that allowed us to reconstruct at least the leg proportions, we think, quite accurately, and the skull very accurately. And so then there are other questions that arise, like what did the feathers look like, what color would it have been, and how large would the body have been. And so we estimated the body size of the bird based on the diameter of its leg bones. So in living birds, the diameter of the leg bones corresponds very closely with the body mass of a living bird. And so that's how we think that the bird was probably about 394 grams. Obviously, we know the skull was about this big, but altogether, I think the bird probably would have been about this big. So we have a pretty good guess of how big it would have been. But why did we make its feathers relatively brown in the pictures? Well, we did that because we think that it lived in the shoreline environment. It had relatively long legs, so maybe its ecology was similar to a living shorebird. Living shorebirds are generally fairly cryptic in their color patterns. They're generally sort of brownish gray. And so that's why we went with that color pattern. But we also reconstructed a bright red face with no feathers on it. So why did we do that? And I'll just share my screen again so you can see what I'm talking about. Whoops. Can you see my screen, Araxi?
No, not yet.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about
that.
Yeah. Okay, so now we'll go over to this nice image of the pollo magnífico. So you can see we reconstructed it with this bare skin around the eye and on the face. So why did we do that? Well, if we look at living representatives of chicken-like birds and duck-like birds, on the chicken side, we see that some of the deepest branches within the chicken-like bird family tree show a lot of bare skin on their face. So, for example, this is a species of guan, which is a neotropical group of chicken-like birds, many of which are present in Mexico, like chachalacas in the genus Ortalis. So this is a guan, and you can see, this is in the genus Penelope, but you can see this bare skin around the eye. So in many guans and other deeply diverging chicken-like birds, like this mound builder from Australia, you see brightly colored skin with no feathers covering it up. But what about on the other side of the family tree, looking at the duck side of the family tree? Well, of course, geese and swans and ducks that we're most familiar with tend to have feathers all over their face. But the deepest and diverging lineages of duck-like birds actually show very similar patterns on their face of bare skin, often brightly colored around the eye. So over here, this is a kind of bird in English called a screamer in the family Anhenidae. So this is a group that only lives in South America today. They're very strange, and they're the sister group to all other duck-like birds. And you can see that, like a guan or a brush turkey, a mound builder, these birds also have bare skin on their face. And so does this bizarre creature, the magpie goose, Anserinus from Australia, which is the sister group to all other ducks, geese, and swans. So all of the aspects of the illustration shown here, I'll show this one, were based on sort of the most educated guesses that we could come up with. Of course, obviously, we can't be sure that the Wonder Chicken was brownish gray, and we can't be sure that it would have had bare patches of skin on its face, but it seems like a pretty well-supported guess. And I think the artist Phil Krasminski did a pretty spectacular job coming up with such a plausible illustration of what this beast would have looked like.
Well, I think the next question will probably need to draw on similar inferences from related groups. So Jose Luis Rangel Salazar is asking, well, obviously saying that it was an excellent lecture, but it also is asking whether there's any evidence of whether the bird would make specific types of calls or if it was a singing bird.
So that's another good question, and of course another question that we can't directly shed light on, but we can answer it with a lot of confidence. So, but in order to answer it, I'll go over to the bird family tree again. You know I love the bird family tree. So I will show my slide again and do a better job of it this time. So I hope you can see the bird family tree here. Okay, so the group of birds that we call songbirds, you know, the most accomplished singing birds, is this group, if you can see my arrow, down here in green. So when you wake up in the morning and you hear bird song outside, usually you hear representatives of that group, the songbirds. And of course, if you're lucky enough to be in Mexico, the songbirds that you hear are really fantastic, excellent, very cool songbirds that I really enjoyed seeing when I was in Mexico a couple of years ago. Now, if we look at the part of the family tree where the Wonder Chicken comes from, where I'm circling over here, we're very far away from songbirds on the family tree. But of course, we know that duck-like birds make noise. Some of them go quack, quack, quack. Some of them go honk, honk, honk. But they don't make very elaborate songs, but they do vocalize. And of course, on the chicken side of the tree, there are some extremely noisy groups. Those chachalacas that I mentioned in the genus Ortalis are famous for being extremely noisy. Araxi, when we were in Jalisco at the Chamela Reserve teaching that field course in Mexico, the species in English called the West Mexican chachalaca was so noisy. It was unbelievable. So we know that chicken-like birds and duck-like birds both make a lot of noise, but they don't sing very elaborate songs. So I think it stands to reason that a fossil bird close to the last common ancestor of those groups almost certainly would have made some kind of vocalization, but it would not have been a beautiful song.
Thank you very much. Yes, I remember that they were very noisy. So it's interesting because combining information from the actual fossil with its information about its living relatives, you can reconstruct a very rich portrayal of how this species must have looked like. So we have another question again regarding specifically the pollo magnífico, but it is asking how this discovery impacts our understanding of where the crown birds first evolved. So this is a question from Ridian Vandercroft, who is saying that from your paper, you do mention how this fossil challenges our view of crown birds originating in the southern hemisphere. So first of all, could you tell us a little bit about those inferences in the paper? And the question goes on to say whether there are any new developments you would like to share with us since that publication.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question, Ridian. I have been in touch with Ridian in Puebla over email. So I'm very grateful that you've joined the call, Mr. Vandercroft. Thank you. So that's a great question. In terms of the major questions that the fossil can help us answer, I think Ridian is correct. I think it probably tells us a lot about where modern birds came from. And this is a very controversial topic in ornithology today. And I'll show you why. I will have to share my screen again to show some new slides. But if you can see my screen right now, what we're looking at is a sort of a depiction of groups of birds in the world today that are restricted to the northern hemisphere, compared with groups of birds today that are restricted to the tropics, predominantly on the southern land masses. So you can see that the distribution of this diversity is not even at all. There are many more groups today found on these southern land masses than there are groups restricted to the northern land masses. So that has led ornithologists for many years to hypothesize that modern birds probably originated in the southern hemisphere. But I think that idea is a little bit less certain today than it was several years ago. One of those reasons has to do with fossils. So if we look at the fossil record of many of these groups that today are only found in the southern hemisphere, we see something very surprising. Here's a family tree of those groups. Those groups shown in pink live in the southern hemisphere, and those groups shown in blue live in the northern hemisphere. But if I make my screen big, if we look at the fossil record of those groups that live in the southern hemisphere, we see that many of those fossils actually come from the northern hemisphere. So I think this is a terrific example of how the fossil record can show that where birds are found today does not necessarily reflect where they originated many millions of years ago. And so this is something that we've been working on quite a bit. This is work done in collaboration with my colleague Aaron Saup, shown over here from Oxford. And we've shown that many groups, for example, if we look at these turcos, which today only live in Africa, actually have fossil representatives from North America. So this is where a fossil turco-like bird comes from 52 million years ago. So this map of the world today in red shows areas that are suitable for turcos to live in, and areas in blue are generally too cold or too dry for turcos to live in. But if you think about how Earth's climate has changed over the last 60 million years, you see something very interesting, which is that when this fossil was alive, North America was much more suitable for occupancy by living turcos than it is today. So in this paper, we argued that many groups of birds have probably dramatically changed where on Earth they live based on how Earth's climate has changed. So I think the only really, really strong evidence we'll ever obtain for where modern birds originated comes from the fossil record. So the fact that the pollo magnífico is the oldest modern bird that we've seen so far, and it comes from Europe, I think is very important because it suggests that maybe birds did not arise in the southern hemisphere, but perhaps they actually arose in the northern hemisphere. I'm not very confident about that. I'd say at the moment, maybe I'm 50-50. But I think that only future fossil discoveries of even older fossil birds will give us a clearer understanding of where modern birds truly did originate. And I'd really like to know the answer to that question.
Thank you very much. So we can say then that you're still working on it.
I can tell Ridian that there are no major developments since the paper came out, because the paper came out on the first day of the lockdown here in the United Kingdom, which has slowed down some progress on research, unfortunately. But I think questions like the question that Ridian asked are exactly the sort of question that I hope 10 years from now we'll have a much clearer understanding of. And maybe Ridian will be the person to answer those questions.
Good, yes. So something to work on. So we have several questions from this website called Crónicas Chiviscoyos. So thank you very much for being today with us and making questions. So one of their questions is also related to avian distribution, not to the origin, but actually more related to diversification. So their question is, why is it that we see so much speciation and so much diversity in the neotropics compared to the rest of the world? And I think this is a pattern that we see not only in birds, but it's actually much more common across basically all clades. So why is it that there's so much biodiversity there?
So that's a great question, and it actually gets back to what I was just talking about when I was answering Ridian's question. So there's always a debate, you know, biogeographers and biologists, regardless of which group they study, everybody is interested in the latitudinal biodiversity gradient. Why do we see more diversity at low latitudes than we do at high latitudes? If you're a bird watcher, it's much more exciting to live in Colombia than it is to live in Cambridge, much as it is unfortunate for me. And this is true for almost any living group of organisms. The tropics are very, very diverse. And so there are lots of ideas about that. I think what I was just explaining when I was answering Ridian's question might provide part of the answer for birds. Because if we go back to that last slide that I was showing, we see that maybe 50 million years ago, higher latitudes seem to have been suitable for occupancy by groups that today are really only found in the tropics. Turcos today are only found in the tropics. So what happens when we look at points in Earth history between 50 million years ago and today? Well, Earth's climate has generally cooled since 52 million years ago. So even by 35 million years ago, this is not a very high resolution map, but you can see Earth's climate was colder across the boundary between the Eocene and the Oligocene about 35 million years ago. And the areas that we estimate to have been suitable for occupancy by these tropical birds seems to begin to be contracting down towards the tropics, down towards these low latitudes. And we can look at all of these various points in time throughout the Cenozoic era, and we can look at lots of groups of birds that today are found in the tropics, but in the past had fossil representatives at high latitudes. And we see that for all of these groups throughout the Cenozoic, the estimated habitable latitudes for these groups contracts through time and becomes centered around the equator in all of these groups. So each one of these squares is a different group of birds today found in subtropical latitudes, but which has a fossil representative, at least one from high latitudes earlier in the Cenozoic. And we see, based on climatic change, that we estimate that for all of these groups, the geographic distribution of those groups probably will have contracted through time. So this is work that we published. This is an old slide. It says the paper's in review. This paper was published last year in PNAS. It's by Aaron Saup and colleagues, and we explore the origin of this latitudinal biodiversity gradient in birds from this climate and fossil perspective. So if you're more interested in that paper, I would encourage you to look up this paper by Saup and colleagues.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have two more questions about the sort of evolutionary events of birds. So we have one from Antonio Lecona, and it says whether there's any evidence of a role of disease in the evolution of bird lineages. And there's a somewhat related question as well, asking about the influence of diet in the survival of bird lineages over the boundary. So you mentioned that arboreal lifestyles basically died out, but whether there was particular types of diets that perhaps allows some lineages to survive.
So those are good questions. I have an answer for the second question, but I do not have an answer for the first question. So I don't think there's really much that we can say about the evolution of co-evolution of birds and disease throughout their evolutionary history. It's obviously an interesting topic, but it's a difficult one for a paleontologist to comment on. So I'll skip to the next question, which is what happened to bird diets across the KPG boundary? And that's a question that some people have thought about. We think, this will be unsurprising, that the surviving lineages of birds had modern digestive systems. That seems to be modern bird digestive systems. That doesn't seem to be controversial at all. But an important thing to think about is what kind of food opportunities may have actually been available in this sort of scorched world after the asteroid struck the Earth. And certain food sources that probably would have been quite abundant include things like insects and seeds. And something interesting about groups that predominantly feed on insects today is that they are uniformly small-bodied if they're insect specialists. It's very difficult to be an insect specialist and be large because you spend all of your energy chasing around little tiny insects. It's difficult to be a large-bodied insect specialist. So insects, in contrast to birds, seem to have suffered much less at the KPG boundary, and it may be that surviving lineages of birds may have done very well eating insects and seeds. I think that's a very plausible idea. The question about birds eating seeds after the KPG boundary is an idea put forward by a Canadian colleague of mine named Derek Larson in a paper that he published in Current Biology in 2016. So if anybody's interested in learning about that in more detail, I would direct you to his paper, Larson and Colleagues, 2016.
Yeah, thank you very much, and also thank you to Tomás Enrique Rivas Salcedo for that question. So going back a little bit to the pollo magnífico, but still staying with the topic of diet, Aaron Hernández is asking whether you have any evidence from looking at the fossil about whether this particular species could be a scavenger, or whether you have any clues as to what it would be feeding on.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Of course, we don't have any direct evidence about what the pollo magnífico would have eaten, but if you look at its beak is very similar in shape to what we see in many chicken-like birds today. And if you've ever kept chickens or spent much time around chickens, you'll know that they can basically eat anything. And being a generalist in terms of diet is probably very, very useful when times are tough. An animal like the pollo magnífico, following the extinction event, probably would have had no difficulty eating insects or eating seeds or eating anything else that might have been available at the time. And so basically having a beak like a chicken's beak is a very useful tool, I think, if you're in a difficult situation.
Yeah, thank you. So Roberto Castellan Lopez asked a question which I think many of us have, but probably were too afraid to ask. And he's asking, when we talk about birds, are we talking about aviale, neorhynith or something like that, does this crown group really stand? So can you explain about 101 avian phylogeny?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, often when people use the word bird, they're using that term in a very general sense. So that would include living birds and their extinct bird-like dinosaur ancestors. When I'm being very, very careful in discussing with my colleagues, I always make sure to restrict my use of the word bird to what we consider to be crown group birds. So the crown group is basically equivalent to modern birds, the last common ancestor of all living birds and all of that ancestor's descendants. So earlier we were talking about enantiornithines, which are outside of living bird diversity. That means an enantiornithine is not a crown group bird, but it would be accurate to call it a bird-like dinosaur. So we have different terms. The ones you mentioned there, aviali and neornithes, those connote different things. Aviali is essentially equivalent to bird-like dinosaurs, so it's the last common ancestor of Archaeopteryx and last common ancestor of Archaeopteryx and living birds and all of that ancestor's descendants. So it's a more inclusive group than crown group birds. And that word neornithes that you were asking before is the same thing as crown group birds. So neornithes is defined to mean crown group birds.
Daniel, there are several additional questions, but I'm getting higher orders through a very convoluted chain of communication involving my son and his granddad. So we are, I think, coming to an end. Okay. There was a question which I think I would like to finish with, if it's not too much to take from your time. And that is, how is it that you decided to become a paleontologist?
Well, thank you for that question. That is a question that I've had a little bit of time to think about during this lockdown. Everybody's sort of wondering how we got to where we are in the present day. And being a paleontologist is something I've always been interested in doing, like many young people are. I was always captivated by fossils and dinosaurs when I was a young child. My parents took me to museums in order to see fossils. I was very, very privileged in that regard. And I was always quite interested in fossils. I was simultaneously interested in birds, but I never sort of realized that those two interests could be combined in any kind of meaningful way until I went to university and started studying evolutionary biology. And as time went on, I became more and more interested in thinking about how fossils can help us understand questions in evolutionary biology. So I realized that the fossil record can help us understand a lot about the evolution of birds. So I decided to become a bird paleontologist. So in some ways, it's the culmination of a dream that I've had since I was a little kid. But, when I was a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, I think I imagined myself digging up Brontosaurus and not necessarily looking at pollo magnífico. But as time has gone on, I've discovered that, to me at least, the pollo magnífico can answer more exciting questions than related to birds, at least, than Brontosaurus can. And so that has sort of steered me in the direction that I'm in today. But it's very enjoyable to think back about how what a 5-year-old version of myself would think about what I'm doing today. And I hope that the 5-year-old would be excited about the teeny tiny little toothless fossil, although I'm not sure that the child would care very much, to be honest.
Well, but I mean, at least these fossils are much easier to fit inside a CT scan. So
that's true. The Brontosaurus presents some practical challenges.
So, Daniel, thank you very much. It was an excellent talk. It generated a lot of interest, a lot of questions. So I apologize for any questions that we didn't get time to
well, thank
say.
You to everybody for those questions.
Yeah,
and muchas gracias a ti, Araxi, and Jaime, and the Colegio Nacional. This was a thrill for me.
Yeah, so
muchas gracias también de mi parte. Soy Dionisio. I want to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. It was awesome, and we are very pleased to have you in Fundación UNAM also with Colegio Nacional. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
David, bye-bye, David. I want to see you again soon.
I hope we can. Thank you very much.
Bye. Very interesting.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
De nada. Bye.
Well, thanks, Daniel, and muchas gracias a todos los que nos han acompañado en esta conferencia muy interesante. Muchas gracias a la Fundación UNAM, al colegio y a todas las universidades participantes. Y les invitamos a que nos acompañen nuevamente mañana en la tarde a las 6 a la presentación de un documental de ciencia sobre 4 ciénegas, también por parte de Fundación UNAM y de Colegio Nacional. Thanks very much, all of you, and hope we can continue with this program for a long time now. Thanks again, Daniel, and thanks to all of you. Y muchas gracias a todos los que se unieron de diferentes lugares, incluyendo Inglaterra, Colombia, Bucaramanga y muchos otros lugares. Esperamos que nos continúen acompañando. Muchas gracias. Saludos a todos.
Gracias, Jaime. Bye.
Buenas tardes de nuevo. Gracias.